Presley, appreciate it very much. And again, thanks folks for joining us here live. Do appreciate it. And so, as Presley said, we're going to be talking about nutrition, thinking about feeding your herd, and we're going to approach this kind of from a different angle, if you would. I'm not necessarily going to be here tonight to tell you how to feed and what to feed, but I'm going to give you the tools to help you understand your nutrition program. If interested, you're able to utilize some of these tools and go back and tweak your rations and maybe improve your management and improve the overall nutritional status of your herd, or you can simply consult with your local nutritionist as well. So the first piece that I always like to start off as we talk about some of these nutritional aspects is a concept that one of my previous colleagues had brought up, and it's the thought of this vitamin of vitamin M. And realistically, there isn't a vitamin M, but when we think about vitamin M, we're talking about management of these animals because that's really where a sound nutritional program is going to begin with. And we need to think about those basics to start off with. So thinking about developing and feeding those rations. So what are we feeding in terms of the species and the stage of production? In our goat industry here this evening, we had some questions last week or a few weeks back that was talking about nutritional needs and demands of a lactating dairy goat and what you would be feeding it. And those are some of the things that we'll be discussing tonight in terms of what are their requirements and what feedstuffs may be able to be fed to achieve those requirements during those peak demands. In terms of feeding management, understanding the average weight of your herd. I know I'm also to blame as a producer. We're not going through and we're weighing everybody on a periodic basis, but it's a good idea to at least do it once annually to kind of gauge yourself and understand the weight of animals that you are feeding in your respective pens or groupings of animal, because really these animals need feed delivered to them, or dry matter, if you would, delivered on a per pound basis or a per head basis on every day. So when we think about how much feed are we feeding, I like to give the idea of weight versus volume. Now, again, many of us probably aren't regularly checking what that 5-gallon bucket weighs. Or you may say 2 scoops of this or a couple coffee cans of that. And that's all fine and well as long as we've got a metric and a way to be able to standardize that. So every time you get yourself a new ration or you put a different ingredient in, all those ingredients have different weights. And so it's important to understand that even though you may be feeding the same volume, you may not, or you may be overfeeding or underfeeding that amount of feed based upon the weight that you're getting. And then thinking about how these animals should be grouped. Are we, having separate feeding areas? Are we housing lactating does away from our gestating does? How are we managing those kids throughout those growth curves and so forth? So those are some things that we need to think about. The first thing beyond that I like to talk about is when in doubt, we need to test it out. And this is a very easy tool that any producer can use. Now, it will cost a little bit in the forefront, but trust me, it will pay dividends in the back end. Now, when we think about feed quality, if you're going to your local mill, hardware, etc., how are we buying feed? It's typically based on percent of protein. That's really how diets are classified. Now, it may be saying you're buying a kid feed, a grower ration for does to doelings, maybe a lactation diet, but associated with that categorization, you also have the amount of protein that's being provided. Okay. But we need to go a little bit further than that beyond protein. We need to understand that if the amount of energy that's being provided in these diets is adequate for the stage of production as well. Because, of course, feed quality can either positively or negatively influence animal growth and performance, health, efficiency, and at the end of the day, profitability. One thing that a lot of folks don't commonly take into consideration are feed toxins. And over the past couple of years, especially with the weather that we've experienced here in Ohio, we've had some major challenges as it's associated with some fungal spore and mold development. Now, of course, these are naturally occurring, and sometimes we just can't help it based upon those conditions. So again, concentration is key. The solution to pollution is dilution. So if you know you have a feedstuff that may be a little hot in terms of toxicity, in terms of these molds or fungal spores, we can typically get other feeds to help dilute that ration that will not negatively impact the production of those animals. However, consumption of elevated levels of these feed toxins may result in a reduction in feed intake, which is something that we can easily report and record, and as well as feed refusal, If they do eat it without refusing it, we may see poor feed conversion associated with a decreased weight gain. We may see an increase in terms of disease incidence and as well as a reduction in reproductive function. So those are some key things that we need to take into account. Now, again, I put this picture up here because between you and I here listening, we really don't know the status or the quality of that hay and that grain that's being fed in that tub. So visual appraisal can be good, right? If it's a really bad, moldy type of hay and it wasn't made right, there may be some off smells, there may be some discoloration. However, even though this feed and this hay here in the picture seems to be relatively clean, we just don't know the absolute quality of it, and that's why it's so important for us to test it out. So the first thing that we're going to talk about again is testing the quality of those feeds. And again, here's just a picture of some brood ewes mid gestation here at one of our research units, hanging out in the field during the winter and just kind of consuming that hay to keep themselves full. But again, we don't know through visual appraisal and analysis what this is. So that's why it's key that we get a feed test or a hay analysis done on our forages on a routine basis, especially for you folks that are purchasing your hay. I always encourage folks to get a test before you purchase it to ensure that you're getting a good deal, right? And that's always key. So some of the things that we like to look at, and these are very easily interpreted. If you do need assistance with it, please feel free to reach out to myself or your local county educator. We can assist with this piece. This can be done through your local co-op, and the extension office may be also able to help you as well to acquire your sample as well as submit your sample. So crude protein, of course, is something that's important for us to take into consideration. ADF, it's not a big nutrition talk this evening if we don't review this. So we'll give you some definitions. ADF is going to be our acid detergent fiber. This represents the proportion of that forage or that feedstuff that is indigestible. So lignin, for example. And then our ANDF, or just NDF, is our neutral detergent fiber, which takes into account those pieces in our acid detergent fiber, as well as some of our more digestible pieces. It really is what is used to capture our fiber value. NDF can be more easily described as the bulk density or how much feed is that animal physically able to put into their system. As you can see here, we've got two vastly different forage types that we were feeding from some of our research that I conducted during my PhD. Crude protein on the left is 8%. The one on the right is 23%. So we can see that vast difference already. The one that has a greater crude protein also has a lower overall fiber value, meaning that this forage is going to be more digestible than the one on the left. Now, it isn't to say that we don't need fiber, because we certainly do when we're working with our ruminant livestock species, but we need it in moderation. The other piece that I like to take at is TDN, or total digestible nutrients. And this number is going to describe the overall usability or digestibility of this feedstuff. The easiest way for us to describe this is it's a percentage of that forage that's being fed. So for example, for the one on the right, you've got 72.78. So for every 100 pounds of that forage being fed, over 70% of that is going to be readily available and digested by that animal. As compared to the one on the left, it is 62.4%. So the one on the left is about, well, a little over 10% less digestible than the one on the right-hand side. So if I had the option between purchasing these two forages, depending upon the stage of production, I would probably be more willing to purchase the one on the right because of the high protein, low fiber value, and greater digestibility of that piece. But if I was just simply trying to get some animals throughout the summer, allowing our pasture to stockpile or something of that nature, some of those animals that really aren't working or gestating, I may go for the cheaper option of that forage on the left-hand side to get me through that period. The other piece that we'd like to think about are the idea of toxins within our feeds as well. And so as you can see here, this is from Purdue University Extension. This is a fact sheet that they've got provided talking about mycotoxin problems both in sheep and meat goats, but it also applies to our dairy goats. I would say that our values for our dairy goats would be lesser than the ones that are presented here because they are expected to perform at a higher level, greater capacity, if you would. So as we take a look at this, both ewes and does that are pre-breeding and or pregnant, when we look at that toxin of zearalenone, you can see that it is a very small level of what can be incorporated into the diet. That's parts per million, both the zearalenone and the vomitoxin here. We can see that pre-breeding, that can be really detrimental if we've got feeds as we're flushing, using a flushing diet. If it's high in zearalenone, we may have a reduction in reproductive capabilities, as you can see here based upon the threshold. Now, this here is a resource for mycotoxins and feed, College of Vet Med's perspective. And what we can see off to the left-hand side is a series of different mycotoxins that we can be analyzing in a feedstuff. In the middle column, you can see some maximum concentrations. And off to the right, we can see types of livestock. But the biggest challenge and issue that I see here is that all species, livestock species, are represented with the exception of small ruminants. So this is just to point out that we do have some challenges as it relates to small ruminant production and understanding what those thresholds are. So we'll go back to that piece that we saw from Purdue University to use that as our metric and use that as our standard. So again, as we're analyzing toxins, they're naked to the eye, folks. We can't take a look at this corn sample alone that's incorporated in our ration itself and say that it's a clean feed source or not. That's why it's so critically important for us to be able to get some of these tests done beforehand. And again, a lot of your mills are going to be periodically running these exams and running these feeds throughout their system to ensure they're of quality for sale. But if you are growing your own crops on farm, this is where it becomes critically important for you to be able to utilize some of these resources and get some of this testing done. Now we compare quality to toxins. Quality feedstuffs depend, or for quality analysis, I should say. When you're thinking about a price parameter, we're looking at about $20 if you're using NIRS technology. If you're going to do wet chem, it's going to be far greater than that, upwards of $80, $90 to $100. But at $20 with the NIRS, it's pretty accurate. A lot of data to support that, and it's a cheap insurance policy to ensure that you are feeding the right amount and type and kind of nutrients to your animals based upon stage of production. Now, our toxin reports are going to be a bit more expensive. The last time that I saw were hovering around $90 to $100. They certainly could be more than that at this point in time, but trust me, how many animals do you have to lose because of toxins, or how many pregnancies do you have to lose because of these toxins to be able to pay for that report in itself? This is some data specifically from a sheep producer that I had interacted with a couple years back, and they were having some serious challenges with both the reproduction as well as growth and performance in their animals. And I encouraged them through a series of chats with them. We found out that these feeds were purchased from a neighbor, stored in some bins, just as you can see on Presley's screen there, without being further analyzed or tested. And what it came to be when we finally got some toxin results on them, you can see that the results were quite concerning from that standpoint. So again, the one that I kind of want to hone in on is the idea of zearalenone. You can see that I've got it highlighted here in that bottom box. You can see it was almost 25,000 parts per billion. And so as you're looking at this figure again from Purdue University, you can see that our threshold is 0.5 parts per billion. So in order to do our conversions here, we're going to move our decimal point 3 places on our parts per billion. So this sample of feed that this individual is feeding, and it was specifically the whole shell corn as the source of it, that's about 2.5 parts per million. And as you can see there, we have way overfed this toxin in the diet as it relates to that minimum threshold that these folks are reporting here, right? But as we get into some of our growing and finishing animals, you can see that they can withstand a greater concentration of that toxin. So this is good information to know, meaning that this feed isn't wasteful at all. We can feed it to a different stage of production of animals without incurring some of these negative effects. Same to be said with Dawn and T2. You can see that these are concerned. I really like this image that comes with this report. We can see that such as our aflatoxins and so forth reported as BDL below the detectable limit. But as we get back into some of these other ones, again, these really should be highlighted as red rather than yellow, right? Because according to this screen, Dawn and zearalenone are way outside on the very far peripheral edge of that figure and that statistic, showing that there are some challenges associated with that feed source, and should be fed with caution. So now we have an appreciation of why we need to be collecting those quality and toxin parameters. Just want to go into the basics of ruminant production, okay? Thinking about that ruminant system, right? We've got this large fermentation vat that has 4 chambers associated with it. First and foremost is going to be that rumen, again, where that fermentation occurs. These volatile fatty acids, or VFAs, are where that is feed source, so that energy source is going to be produced. And that VFA is being utilized by those microbial populations. And so many folks think that we are feeding this feed sources, whether it be grain, byproducts, or forages, or a combination of all the above, to feed that animal. But the reality is, in a ruminant system, we're feeding the microbial population within that system first and foremost. Again, you can see that there are some protein and vitamin production there. B vitamins are actually produced by those rumen microbes within the system. The reason why vitamin B specifically, or those vitamins in that category, may be supplemented to an animal, maybe one that was sick, treated with antibiotics, and so forth, because the microbial populations are depressed and not producing nearly as much. The second location that this feed's going to go to is the reticulum. That's that honeycomb structure. It's really our sorting device that allows for length and size. When we think about water filtration within this system, it's coming into the omasum, and that's going to be our third chamber, our third compartment. This is really where our water is recycled and returned back to the system. And then lastly but not least, our abomasum is kind of that fourth and last stop before we get into the intestinal section. That abomasum is considered our true stomach. It's an acidic environment, and that's where a lot of those feedstuffs that haven't been previously broken down by those microbes will begin to break down. It's not a parasite talk this evening, folks, but when we talk about parasitology and parasitic infection in our small ruminants, that abomasal compartment is where a lot of those challenges and where a lot of those populations are harbored. And then, of course, after that, we're going to go to our small intestine, where a lot of that nutrient absorption occurs, especially if we have any type of bypass protein. So these are some important categories for us to think about. One that's not listed here, we'll talk in a few slides, is water. That's going to be our most important nutrient that we can utilize and cheapest in our systems. So when we think about energy, that's really derived from our volatile fatty acids, the result of digestion of cellulose from forages and starch from our grains. When we think about protein, that's going to be available both in our feedstuffs, but as well as that microbial protein as those microbes turn over within that system. Vitamins, both looking for those fat and water-soluble vitamins. And then in terms of minerals, we're looking for those macros and those micros. In terms of nutrient categorization, really when we think about energy, carbohydrates come to mind, both our fiber, our structural, and our sugars. So we see them in our grains, corn, wheat, barley, and oats. Molasses is a nice sugar source, and that's going to be a readily available energy source. Soy hulls are a byproduct that our small ruminants do really well on, and that could be considered as a fiber source. And of course, our forages. In terms of proteins, those are going to be our amino acids, and the basis of those are nitrogen. So thinking about soybean meal, distillers grains, DDGS would be our dried distillers grains with solubles, corn gluten, blood meal, and forages as well. Thinking about some of those high quality alfalfas or those legumes that provide a lot of protein. Our lipids, or our fats, we can see those in oils and tallows, specifically non-ruminants, right? But those are going to be a good energy source as well. And we've already talked about some of the importance of vitamins and minerals, and we'll have a little bit of a discussion here in our subsequent slides. But I just wanted to review a couple of nutrition, what I call quick bits that some folks may not necessarily realize, and understanding the difference between different energy sources. What we're going to talk about is acetate and propionate, and the only thing that we need to know for tonight's discussion are those are some volatile fatty acids produced by the rumen microbes, and it's going to be based upon the type of feed that's being ingested. For acetate, this is primarily used for fatty acid synthesis for both sub-Q or back fat and seam fat, but also for milk fat, okay? So where do we get an influx of acetate from? As you can see here, high concentrate grain-based diets do result in increased propionate production relative to an acetate production, which is coming from our forage base. The reason that I bring this up, folks, when we're thinking about feeding does prior to kidding, I always encourage a really highly valuable, high quality, high digestibility forage right before kidding, because we're going to be able to increase the amount of acetate production within the system, and acetate within there is going to contribute to milk fat synthesis. The reason why we want that is we want high quality colostrum within our systems for those young kids, because they can't drink a lot or consume a lot in terms of volume, but they do need something that is nutrient dense, and that's where that acetate comes into play. Now, as we get further into our lactation curve, we can add grains to that because grains are going to increase the concentration of propionate within the system, and that is going to contribute to more of milk volume when we're talking about production dose. And as you can see here, greater levels of glucose as a result of the propionate within these systems can result in greater average daily gain, more lean tissue growth per day. And if we're thinking about meat quality, we can get some marbling deposited because of that within the system. Water, of course, as I said earlier, is a really important feed source or nutrient, if you would, that needs to be incorporated. The only reason I bring this up is that when we think about every pound of dry matter that we're feeding to these animals, it takes about 7 pounds of water to be able to digest that. So close to a gallon of water. But the other thing that I want us to understand is that cold water too can greatly decrease feed intake and therefore digestibility because the rumen is really functioning at a temperature that's greater than 100 degrees. So as you can see in the background here, we do have heaters in some of our waters on one of our projects because we had issues and challenges with our water freezing out in the field. And so we were just simply trying to, one, avoid issues with breaking ice, but also avoid further issues with a depression and feed intake itself. Because at the end of the day, if we're forcing these animals to drink extremely cold water because we went out there and busted the ice chunks up in the bucket, they intake that water, and it takes a lot of energy for that system to warm that water up and be able to fully utilize it within the system. I'm not contributing or advocating for people to go out there and feed really hot water to our animals, but we want to make sure that our water isn't frozen and take kind of the chill out of it if you would. Keep it behind a windbreak. Pieces of advice as such will greatly improve the digestibility of any type of diet that you're feeding your animals compared to frozen water or really cold water. In terms of basics of nutrition, we do need to understand that there are differences between protein and energy, right? We've already talked about how feedstuffs are sold. It's basically done based upon percent crude protein because that is going to be the most expensive proportion of a diet. When we think about energy, we talked about these pieces already on a couple slides before: carbohydrates, fats, and sugars, right? The body doesn't have a requirement for carbohydrates, but it does have a requirement for energy itself. But it isn't to say that crude protein isn't important. I'll show you an example at the very end of our slideshow here. So that's why it's important that balance is critical. So not all feeds are created equally. For those folks that are going out and purchasing some feed, I do realize that this is a lamb finisher feed, but for the purposes of our demonstration, I want us to take a look at a few things. As you can see here, it states that the minimum crude protein is going to be 16%. Very rarely are they going to go beyond that, again, because that's the most expensive proportion of that diet. It also states that not more than 1% is coming from NPN, which is non-protein nitrogen, and that's going to be urea. And that's where we really like to see that to be. The challenge that I have here with this feed stuff in specific are the ingredients. The ingredients are always listed with the greatest proportion of that ingredient being listed first. As you can see here, that is grain products. That's open to their interpretation, folks. That could be any type of grain that can be incorporated into this. And some manufacturers do this on purpose because they're going to be chasing the cheapest or lowest cost commodity within spec to be able to achieve that crude protein and some of those same values. The problem with this is that our feedstuffs may be fluctuating throughout the year based upon markets available for some of our commodities. As you can see here, number 2 is animal protein products, and number 3 is plant protein products. And so this really is extremely vague and doesn't give me a good picture of what is being provided to these animals. Now, as compared to our second example here, same type of feed as you can see up here above, a minimum of 16% crude protein. So we would assume it's a very similar type of diet. But what we can see here is that every time that we go and purchase this diet, we know that the number one ingredient within this diet is going to be wheat middlings, and that's a really digestible and high quality feed store stuff for our livestock species. Number 2 is dehulled soybean meal. Number 3 is ground corn. So you can see the differences already on how this one's a bit more transparent in terms of the products that are being made available. Now, if I had to guess between this product and the one on the previous slide, the one on the previous slide will more than likely be a cheaper option because they're able to get their cost parameter down because they're able to mix and match based upon commodity prices. This one here is going to be fixed a bit more and is going to follow those commodity prices. So, for example, as corn prices increase or decrease, as it's happening now, our feedstuff way match that because it is the third ingredient within this list. So I wanted to dive in a little bit in terms of goat research to provide a little bit of intel for you guys on what we could be doing in terms of different diets and different rations to be looking at. And so it was a bit challenging for me to put this together because reality is that US based research is quite limited in terms of finishing options. This was just an example that I wanted to pull up here. So we've got two here, one from Kansas and one from Louisiana State University. And so when we think about this again, this is really for our finishing diets because that's something that we can control. I've got a question down here. What about grazing research or should we say browsing research? Because our goats are browsing animals, right? They'd rather eat with their head above their shoulders themselves. And so that's where it can be a bit challenging because the way that they behave and the things that they like to eat, it's really difficult for us to quantify and put a value to some of these forages that goats would much rather go after. So the first one we want to review here is from Kansas State. Ryan and colleagues there from 2007. And what they were doing was looking at boar kids fed varying levels of concentrate feed. They had three treatment groups themselves, as you can see that they were outlined here. Treatments 1 through 3, the concentrate level that was offered was increased by 20%. So the lowest being 20%, the highest being 90%. The rest of that ration was comprised of some type of forage. You can see that there were 48 crossbred boar meat type kids, 12 animals per diet. They were on feed for 126 days, and you can see the proportion of that diet, anywhere from 41 to 77% of dry rolled corn, 10 to 50% of alfalfa hay. So that alfalfa hay would make up 50% of treatment one. You can see 0 to 22% of soybean meal, and that 2% of mineral was consistent across treatment groups. So when we take a look at kid performance based upon percent of concentrate in the diet, you can see the traits that they were analyzing or interested in are off to the left-hand side across that top row, or yes, you'll see the concentrations of the concentrate within the diet. The one piece that I want us to really hone in here is when we think about overall efficiency, they found that 70% was really the sweet spot. If you went up to that 90%, of course, that's going to increase the cost of your diet. But in terms of, for example, final body weight, it was actually greatest for our animals that were incorporated into the 70% weight. So you can see nearly 70 pounds. For our average daily gain itself, greatest here for our 70%. As well as our dry matter intake, and our feed conversion was quite well here too. So thinking about this here, we can see that if we're looking to feed out kids of our meat variety, but even of our dairy kids that are used for meat production too, some of those wethers, we can think about incorporating concentrate into their diet at about 70%. Once we go beyond that, they become a bit less efficient. So they kind of demonstrates that they do need some type of roughage within their diet, and they do better with it. The second one comes from Maynard there from 2015 from LSU, part of a master's thesis. And what he was interested in was taking a look at these Savannah crossbred boar kids that were fed these dried distillers grains because at the time, DDGSs were pretty inexpensive or cost effective, I should say. And from time to time, they can be to be able to incorporate these into a successful diet. So they had four treatment groups. You can see the incorporation of DDGS anywhere from 0% to 45%. These animals were on feed for approximately 63 days. This is similar to cattle, so thinking about them in terms of PEM that may be associated with higher levels of sulfur within the diet. Can goats also withstand a high level of DDGS or a concentration of DDGS within their diet? So you can see here what the diet was comprised of, anywhere from that 39 to 71% whole shell corn based upon the concentration of DDGS within the diet. You can see anywhere from 0 to 15.5% soybean meals and some minerals as well. So when we look at performance here, there really isn't any differences in terms of body weight based upon the incorporation of DDGS within the diet. over this 9-week period. However, one thing that we can point out is from a numerical standpoint, now statistically it wasn't different, but from a numerical standpoint, those kids that were exposed to a diet that was greater in concentration in terms of DDGS, that 45%, had a lesser body weight gain compared to their counterparts. So if we were taking a look at DDGS and thinking that it's an inexpensive both energy and protein source based upon the commodity and the time of year, it may be of benefit to incorporate up to upwards of 30% within that diet. Because as you can see, for the long run, numerically, until about week 6, these kids were performing greater than those. And again, apologies that this is in metric here, but if we want to convert our values, just multiply our metric number by 2.2, and that'll get the poundage in terms of weight of what those kids were weighing, respectively. So as we're taking a look at some of this pricing based upon these feeds of the inclusion within the diet, in terms of gain to feed, as we look here, it looks like 0 to 15% incorporation are valued exactly at the same in terms of that gain to feed ratio. But if we're thinking about feed to gain, it takes more to get more gain out of these animals as we look at it on this higher spectrum. So again, although we maybe wanted to finish kids out at a greater rate, if we're going to feed them for an extended period of time, greater than 6 weeks, what we can see here, it may pay off to just incorporate it at a 15% rate itself. Some other pieces that I wanted to bring to your attention come from Ohio State here, from research that was conducted here on our Worcester research station. Now, this was performed with lambs, but it still can be translated to our goats and our kids. This one looked at corn processing and fiber source within these systems. We had 2 different treatments that were occurring at once. The first treatment, or our first main effect, was corn type. It was either ground corn, as you can see here in the number 4 circle, or whole shubbed corn, as seen here in our number 1 circle. We also were looking at the effect of fiber within the diet as well, taking a look at providing no fiber, our fiber source being soy hulls, or our third fiber source being peanut hulls. Again, this comes from Jesus here from 1999. As you can see here, we've got our ground corn versus our whole shelled corn, and we're going to kind of focus on this piece first as it takes a look at the growing and finishing phase of these lambs. When we look at average daily gain, actually, our average daily gain for lambs that were offered a whole shelled corn-based diet had a greater average daily gain, and they were significantly greater compared to their counterpart. So again, what this demonstrates here is that at the end of the day, we can do a lot of things with whole shelled corn. It not only saves us money because grinding and further processing of the corn does cost money at the mill, but also think of the reduction of the dust and other materials that are created during that time period. We may also be able to reduce barn cough within our animals and some of those other issues that we do see within our systems. As it relates to fiber source, what we can see is in terms of average daily gain, we see some significant differences here. It shows that fiber is of value even within these growing and finishing phases for these growing lambs. So regardless if it's soybean hulls or peanut hulls, those lambs performed greater, had a greater average daily gain as compared to those that were not receiving any type of fiber themselves. When we take a look at days on feed, so time required for finishing, you can see that those animals that were given some type of fiber finished with less days on feed. So that's extremely important for us to point out, right? In terms of opportunity costs, we were able to get rid of these animals at an earlier date. We don't have the liability of keeping those animals, and we were able to turn them over at a quicker rate as compared to those animals that did not receive any type of fiber within their system. So the take home here, folks, is really that corn type, whether you process it or not, does matter, and whether you choose to provide some type of fiber, whether it be within the ration itself as a pellet or as a little bit of free choice hay off to the side. As we talked earlier about how feeds aren't created equally, I do want to point out that not all mineral is created equally as well. We've got kind of a side-by-side comparison here, but the one off to the right, left-hand side, you can see has an extremely high concentration of salt, anywhere from 90 to 95% salt. The reason why we're including or incorporating salt into any of our rations is that it is an intake limiter. So we're trying to regulate the intake or the consumption of whatever we're trying to offer to these animals. And in some cases, this can be detrimental to our systems because some animals just don't crave salt like others do. Again, this is typically a micro pack or a micro mineral pack that is hand mixed into a 50-pound bag of salt. The biggest challenge or problem that I see here is that folks don't incorporate that mineral well enough and that every bite isn't consistent. The reason I bring this up is that I always encourage folks to get a pre-made mineral by a reputable company that is formulated specifically for your species. The example being is that there are some companies out there that provide a sheep and goat mineral. I would much rather see you provide a mineral that is formulated for goats because 9 times out of 10, that sheep and goat mineral will not be beneficial to your goats because it will be lacking copper and maybe lacking in some other minerals. As we look at our analysis here on the right-hand side, you can see that our salt concentrations are greatly reduced, almost cut in a fourth. The other thing that I want us to take a look at is the form that these minerals are being provided in. As you can see on the left-hand side, we've got some oxides. How do we commonly use any type of nutrient or anything within a body? That's through oxidation, right? The incorporation of oxygen. And so if this is already oxidized, how are we going to be able to utilize this efficiently? The example that I also like to give is that sometimes on these labels, I will see in order to supply iron will be iron oxide. Another fancy way that we can describe iron oxide is rust. And how digestible is rust to our animals? Just to kind of get that point across. On the right-hand side, we can see that these are zinc amino acid complex, and that'll make a bit more sense on the next slide here, next couple of slides. But this zinc mineral is attached to some type of amino acid or a protein source. Proteins are highly usable and digestible within our systems, and this would be a greater availability to the animal. Now, I'm not to say that these minerals are priced the same because they aren't. The one on the left-hand side is going to be far cheaper than the one on the right. When we think about mineral nutrition, you pay for what you get, and I always encourage folks to get a really high quality mineral. To put this more into perspective, we need to think about bioavailability of these minerals themselves. For example, we're going to use the sulfate form here. This is adapted from Green from 1995. Copper, magnesium, and zinc. As we look at copper, for example, for goats, if it is copper oxide, it is virtually inaccessible by our goats. So if you're feeding a mineral that says that they're providing copper oxide, you would assume that these animals are being offered copper of some sort. But according to this table here, you can see that as it is compared to the sulfate form, copper oxide is not providing much to the animal itself. Now, if you're feeding like a chelated copper or a copper amino acid complex, you can see that it does greatly improve the bioavailability of that mineral itself. I also like to think about the limitations of the minerals that we're utilizing. The one that I like to talk about is selenium, and it can be easily shown here in Liebig's barrel or Liebig's law of the minimum. I like this barrel with the different heights of rungs. So for example, if we have a selenium deficiency, which we commonly have here in the state of Ohio, if we don't provide that through our nutrition, we'll never be able to get that rung any higher. So as our barrel fills up with water, we'll never be able to fill that water barrel up any further than its weakest link or our lowest rung. Now, for example, if we have challenges associated with, let's say, zinc, right? There may be some challenges where zinc inadvertently through our web here might be getting tied up somewhere within our system. So again, as we think about offering a free choice mineral in its loose form, we need to make sure that we're getting one that is being readily supplied and one that is of great bioavailability. The last piece that I'm going to hammer home for us is thinking about mineral form. Now, again, I understand that this example here, again, is from lambs and is looking at salt intake, but I want us to look at salt form, either offered as a loose salt mineral or as a block mineral. And as you can see here, that our intake doubled when we offered that salt in the loose form compared to the block form. We also have some supporting research here at the university that shows that the overall average daily gain of grazing lambs that were consuming loose mineral was greater than those that were consuming a block mineral themselves. So at the end of the day, if you have the option, I always encourage folks to provide a loose mineral at free choice. But if it's the decision between block mineral or no mineral at all, the block mineral certainly will be a better alternative than not providing a mineral at all within your system. Sorry, just jumping through some slides here. So kind of to wrap up our discussion this evening as we're coming kind of to the conclusion of our time together, I wanted to go over some of our NRC requirements for meat goats as well as dairy goats. So as you can see here, we've got our animal classification off to the left-hand column. You can see it's either in maintenance. We've got early gestation with a single, twins, triplets, or more. I should have put that in there, my apologies, as well as the same parameters with late gestation. You can see here that this is for a doe, non-dairy. She's average weight of 132 pounds. Again, this is just an example, folks. Feel free to get back in touch with me and we can get the exact numbers for the average weight of your herd. And this is why it's critical to get some of those weight parameters within your operation. Across the top, you can see some of the requirements. This is going to be her estimated daily intake, so pounds per day, based upon stage of production. If you don't believe me, you can also take a look at percent body weight on a dry matter basis. So if you've got an animal that, for example, weighs 140 pounds, you can use some of these metrics here that'll get you to a close estimate. Required TDN, if you remember from our discussion before, that's going to be our total digestible nutrients, and this is based upon pounds per day. And then we also have percent crude protein, which is available on a gram per day basis. And don't worry about that. We're going to go through a little bit of math together that'll help make this a bit more formal for us. Now, we do want to understand that these values do underestimate for dairy production, and that's why on a subsequent slide, I do have information for dairy does. But the one thing that I do want us to take home this evening is that we can appreciate that as animals go through gestation and as they have a greater number of fetuses within, the requirements increase. And this table here itself shows that quite well. This is going to be our NRC requirements for our dairy goats. As you can see, it's the same weight parameter and same metrics that we're looking for. Our estimated intake, percent body weight, required TDN, and our crude protein. You can see that for these does of the same weight and maintenance, these numbers are relatively the same because these animals aren't working. They don't require excess nutrients. However, as we take a look at gestation and early and late gestation, I don't have anything provided for lactation, but we can certainly find that information for you as well. We can see that their intake does increase compared to their non-dairy counterparts. And because their intake does increase, it's because they're looking to require or are in need of more nutrients to digest as well as more crude protein, a greater percent, I should say. Again, at the end of the day, as we go through these production parameters, the more fetuses that we have and the later in gestation we go, the greater the nutrient demands. I also wanted to pull some information for our growing kids, both the meat and dairy kids. As you can see here that we've got some of these outlined, they're all for a 77-pound kid, kind of looking at what I consider that growing phase or even finishing phase, dependent upon the market that you're into. So we've got animals at 77 pounds, whether they're dairy, boar, or other. That other is going to include some of our companion animals, more of our miniature breeds, our Nigerian dwarf, our pygmies, and so forth. Our kinders are going to be included in there. And then we also have our males separated here as well for production purposes. And then we have an estimated body weight gain that we're wanting to really aim for itself. As you can see here, we're looking to get anywhere from less than half a pound a day to a little bit greater than a half a pound a day, just for reference itself. Just as we saw before, we do have an estimated intake in pounds per day, percent body weight of that dry matter itself, required total digestible nutrients in pounds per day, and crude protein, right? And as you can see here, those animals that in this example that are male and we would expect to have a greater body weight gain on a daily basis are going to have greater nutrient requirements, greater intake demand as it's compared to some of our slower growing animals. So again, we can tweak our diets based upon cost, economics, what market we're trying to hit, and so forth. So we can really hone in and make our operations a bit more efficient utilizing this data. So I want to come back here for our example to round us out for this evening, taking a look back at this non-dairy doe. So this meat doe, she's weighing 132 pounds. This is the same slide that I showed you just earlier, folks, from that NRC from 2007. So what I want us to take a look at first is those required total digestible nutrients. As you can see here, for example, a doe in maintenance, weighing 132 pounds. She's going to require about 1.32 pounds of total digestible nutrients on a daily basis. And that's all going to be in dry matter as well. So I keep going back to that idea of dry matter and thinking about our feed sources. You may think that they are dry, and they certainly are, but they are going to have some type of moisture to them. Our grains are going to be greater than 90% when we put them in and do an analysis. And if you're feeding dry hay, that's also going to be the case. But think about if you're grazing pasture. You may have to graze far more pasture because it's going to have a lot more moisture in it in order to meet some of these demands. So those are just some things that we need to take into consideration. But again, for the purposes of our demonstration this evening, using required TDN on this 132-pound doe. So using your forage test, this is an example that I love to give, and this was some data that we collected at one of our research projects that actually got canceled because of sleet and snow, but nonetheless, it provided a really good data set for us to utilize. As you can see here, we were interested in grazing different types of forages during the fall period, especially November and December. We were grazing brassicas. Those are primarily our purple top turnips, a really cheap and effective feed source. These were bin run oats that were planted in August and September and gave us a lot of dry matter and were of high quality until the frost took those out. And then we also compared it to stockpiled pasture, primarily fescue based, because that's what's going to stockpile really well. And that's what's available for us here in the state of Ohio. We took parameters here on the 8th of November, and we also took them in the middle of December on the 13th. We've got crude protein values from our forage analysis, as well as fiber value, how much bulk density, how much of that fibrous material are they going to be able to consume, and then also what was the total digestible nutrient concentration on those diets. So using that information, I want us to calculate the total digestible requirements for a 132-pound non-dairy doe using those TDN values from the forage samples that we collected in November. And so I've got all this provided for us. We've got this doe, we've got her in maintenance, for example, on the top line. Her estimated intake is 2.5 pounds, and what she requires on a daily basis is or 1.32 pounds of total digestible nutrients. And so what we're going to do, for example, is we're going to take this percentage, so 0.7278, and we're going to multiply that by our intake of 2.5. And we're going to get that value here for our brassicas themselves. So if we were to do all this math, and I've already done it for us this evening, is we've taken this percentage, multiplied it by 2.5, and we got 1.83. Now, what does this tell us? So if we color code it here, what we can see here is that this is what her required TDN was. And if she ate at her full capacity, eating this forage source alone, you can see that she was consuming 1.83 pounds per day of total digestible nutrients. So as we compare that to this, we can all agree that 1.83 is greater than 1.32. So therefore, she will be able to sustain herself during maintenance on this forage alone in the middle of November, if that's when you are grazing it. However, you can see I've got a red box down here, and this is where it kind of raises some concern, especially if you've got some early kidding going on there in December or January. If you've got a doe and you're not feeding her any type of supplemental feed and she's grazing these brassicas, she's going to have a required TDN of 1.96. Now, if she's just got a single, she's going to eat about 3.7 pounds of feed a day. You can see that we're well above that metric. All these values are greater than that. But as we get down into these does that are in late gestation that are carrying more than two kids or more, you can see that we're safe to feed them on brassicas and oats. But if we were only giving them this stockpile pasture that I've described, this is where it can be a pretty big concern. The reason I've got these blue and not red is because although this value is greater than this value, in my mind, that's pretty marginal. And what we need to do is here in this situation, what happens if this doe really can't consume nearly 3.5 pounds of dry matter on a daily basis. She may require some type of supplementation in order for her to sustain herself, because the last thing that we want to do is hinder her intake during this time period and not successfully be able to rear those kids because she's in poor condition. Or during that last 50 days of gestation, that's when 70% of fetal growth occurs. We want to ensure that those kids will be healthy and vigorous during that time period. The other piece that I want us to take a look at before we close out is this thought of crude protein. So again, nothing has changed, folks. It's still the same parameters. We're just simply looking at crude protein here on a gram per basis day. So what we need to do is calculate crude protein requirements for this same doe, and we're going to use those same metrics of those forages that were available in mid-November. So again, thinking about that doe in maintenance, 132 pounds, she's going to eat, again, 2.5 pounds of dry matter, and we need about 78 grams of protein. So how do we do that, right? As we start to think and scratch our mind, what we need to consider is that 454 grams equals 1 pound. So if we go back here and we do our conversions to get it into pounds, we can work it quite easily. So as you can see here, another example is that doe in maintenance, she's going to eat 2.5 pounds of feed. She's going to require 0.17 pounds of crude protein on a daily basis. So if we think about that abstractly, and this is just simply for an example, if we were feeding a feed that was 17% crude protein, and if we fed her 1 pound of that 17% crude protein feed, we would theoretically meet her crude protein requirements on that daily basis in a maintenance status. So what we're going to do, just the same as we did before, we're looking at those forage types off to the right-hand side, our brassicas, oats, and stockpiled pasture, and our crude protein. Remember, one was extremely great, 23%. Oats, what we consider rocket fuel, right? A little over 25%. And then pretty respectful for our stockpiled pasture at 14.5. So we're going to take these percentages, multiply them by our intakes, and we're going to get our values. We've got them punched out right here, and it shows a very similar story as what we've seen before. All of these forages, if they were grazed alone, are going to be able to provide enough crude protein to our does within these systems. However, where it gets a bit more challenging are those does in late gestation that have more than one fetus, and they are being offered stockpile pasture only. And so this is where we can offer some type of ration or protein source pretty cheaply, pretty effectively to be able to get them up over that hump. And again, these values are greater than what we're seeing in terms of a crude protein requirement on a daily basis, but they're far too close for comfort for me because we just don't know at that time in gestation if those does are going to be able to eat nearly 3.5 pounds of forage just simply due to the fiber content, as we've already discussed before, but also because of the capacity they may have internally because of those kids that are available. Now, this isn't to say that you can only do this with some of our forages. You can also do this with some of your rations that you have. But 9 times out of 10, a ration is going to be developed to be able to provide enough crude protein and energy for those animals based upon their stage of production. But if you're interested in doing some home remedies and making some of your own rations, or if you really want to focus on being more of a sustainable operation, looking at some of your own homegrown feeds, such as forages and or grains, this is a really good way to get yourself back into check. And then also, it's a good way to figure out how much feed do I need to feed to meet my requirements. And then beyond that, I can feed some of that poor quality hay or moderate quality hay to be able to just simply fill up the systems of these animals to be a bit more efficient rather than wasting that time and that money in terms of that expensive feed cost. So at the end of the day, what else does this figure here tell us about crude protein and crude protein requirements? What I'm taking away from this is that 9 times out of 10, as you can see here, if she was going to eat 2.5 pounds of this brassica on a daily basis, She's over half a pound, neither 6/10 of a pound per head per day on crude protein. This tells me that we commonly overfeed crude protein within our systems. And so, if we can get a better grasp of what those daily requirements are on our does or any of our animals within our system, we may have the ability to greatly reduce the feed bill at the end of the day. Because realistically, feed prices are going to be driven by the amount of crude protein and the quality of the feed being provided to those individuals.